Thank you. Thank you, Kai, for that very warm welcome. It's somewhat strange being an SSAT employee and getting the opportunity to address conference, and I really do appreciate it, because if this conference is about excellence for all, then that needs to include those children with special educational needs, who are going to be at least 20% of any school's population, if not more if you're a special school, obviously. And so it's that I want to address this afternoon. And I've got for you a premise and a challenge. My premise is that the children in our schools have changed. And the challenge for you is, have our schools changed? Which of you, particularly those of you who've been teaching a long time, would not tell me that, particularly in the last 10 years, you have seen some significant changes in the child population coming into your schools? Those have been your hunches, those have been your gut reactions, and it's still fine in teaching to have those hunches and gut reactions. Well, is there a true evidence base to support then some of those hunches? Let's begin by looking at some of the numbers. If you had said to me at the beginning of this year, Barry, how many disabled children do we have in the UK? I would have said to you, well, the figure we have currently, based on the 2004 household survey census, is 700,000 children. And then in June this year, this government-commissioned piece actually appeared, which actually tells us that by 2009, we had 950 disabled children in the UK. So between 2004 and 2009, we had seen a rise of 250,000 children. A staggering number. And we need to ask ourselves why. And you'll see the first part of that quote actually refers to intergenerational poverty, which I'll come back to in a moment, and certainly modern medical progress. One of the most startling features of modern medical progress has actually been the survival rates of premature babies. Now, my maths is not brilliant. Those of you who have better maths, I'd be happy for you to refine my figures. But just bear with me while I go through some crude figures with you. Every year in the UK, 80,000 children, babies, are born prematurely. 90% now, with modern medical progress, 90% survive, so around 72,000. And of those, 63% have a disability that gives rise to some special educational need. So let's say that's around 50% plus. So in a 5-year period, 5 times 50, we get our 250,000. And that does not take account of any of the other 21st century causes of disability. We have a tsunami of children about to hit our system. Those people that I hear representing special schools will tell you that very vividly. It's already creeping into early years education and into primary, and it's on its way through to secondary education. This term has also crept into our modern parlance: complex needs. Complex needs. What does that actually mean? Because already you can go around schools and you'll see some schools labelled as schools for children with complex needs. Well, actually, we did not have a definition. There were words in the literature that would provide us with something of a definition. The key to complex needs is that there are 2 or more disabilities or special needs coexisting in a child. And often, those needs interlock, overlap, and indeed can compound one another. The health term, you may have seen it on reports you sometimes receive on children coming into your schools, is comorbidity. A very useful term as well is co-occurring. I'll tell you the disability I think that co-occurs most, seems to come and cohabit with any other sort of special educational need, is that of mental health. And I was delighted to hear Andy Burnham mention that. Because it seems to me that the day-to-day impact of living in this 21st century with some significant special educational need is actually eroding the emotional health, the emotional well-being of many of our children with special needs. In fact, for every 5 children on the special needs registers of your school, for every 5, 3 will have a special educational need. I haven't made that up. That's Office of National Statistics. So for every 5 children, 3 with a special need, 3 will have a mental health problem. Does our curriculum reflect that? Is the percentage of curriculum time given to emotional well-being reflecting that need in our child population? The definition you may be most familiar with about complex needs is the one that I'd call the staff room definition. As Kai said in the introduction, I've actually had 3 headships. And I used to love to be in the staff room, usually late September, because that's when this phenomena can actually be witnessed. And I used to like to be in the chair diagonally opposite the staff room door. I used to pray that it wasn't the pregnancy chair, because that would have certainly been a modern phenomenon. And I would wait for the day when the staff room door would fly open, and there would stand some red-faced member of staff, hands on hips, saying, "Well, I've never seen a child like this before." And they were right. They probably had never seen a child like this before. And that's happening time and time again in our education system. We are seeing children the likes of which we have never seen before. And I said we didn't have a national definition, but one of the roles that I have through SSAT at the moment is SSAT is actually carrying out for the department, instigated by the Labour administration, but accepted now by our current Secretary of State. We're carrying out a project on complex learning difficulties and disabilities, CLDD. And that will now be the official term. Part of our remit within that project was to write the national definition for CLDD, which we've done, but not just sitting in a room in Millbank Tower. We've done that with our schools that have been working with us on this research project. We had 12 development schools. Teachers have said these words now resonate with the children that we are educating. That definition, I heard 2 weeks ago, has now been accepted by the department. The department will now put in legal procedures that probably from about 2012, there can be annual statistical returns against children with CLDD in your child populations. There's a website there, and you'll be able to actually access that definition. You'll also see this term starting to spring up more and more, vulnerable children. In fact, the coalition government, in its statement so far about special educational needs, very much use the term vulnerable children. They talk about getting the highest quality education and care for vulnerable children. I want to remind you that the coalition government was elected in May. So the fact that back in March this year, I had an article published around vulnerability, it wasn't just a precursor for the current government, I want to assure you. And in that, I actually talked about what I called a continuum of vulnerability. It seems to me that with all of these new diverse special needs and disabilities we're seeing in our schools, the one thread that seems to bind all of the children together is their vulnerability. And I actually think vulnerability can come about through the 3 Ds of disadvantage, deprivation, and disability. Disability I'm going to unpack more in a moment. But go back to my opening quotation where that research study talked about intergenerational poverty. Intergenerational poverty. Let's not forget, colleagues, what a profound impact disadvantage and deprivation can have on the life opportunities and life attainments of many of our children. The fact that a parent may not be in work can affect the income to a household. Housing may be inadequate to meet a child's needs. And it is, again, Office of National Statistics, it is 3 times more expensive to rear a child with a special need or disability than it is to rear the typically developing child. 3 times more expensive. And yet, a family's capacity to earn an income may be somewhat restricted. In our national cohort around complex needs, which is what the Trust has actually had, we have the national cohort of children to analyse, to look at, to discover what their learning needs are. We interviewed all of the families of the children in that national cohort. And one of the examples that to this day breaks my heart is of a really wonderful set of parents who had had a son prematurely. When he came home, he was oxygen dependent, he was nasogastric tube fed. Mother planned to return to work, but couldn't. Their mortgage was built on 2 salaries. And after 6 years and a second child, they lost their much-loved home that they'd worked so hard to create for their family. That is the impact of 21st century disability on some of our families. So, I mentioned prematurity in particular. Last Christmas Eve, it's really poignant. I received this email from a mother. The session I led at the SSAT conference last year had been reported on in the Times Ed, and somehow she'd read it. And she wrote to me about her son who'd been born at 24 weeks, how his first term in a mainstream primary school had gone. And she said they were great teachers, a really nice school, very accepting, very welcoming. But every day the teacher called her in and said, "Mrs. Jones, could I just have a word?" And she regaled to her Johnny's misdemeanors of the day. Every day Mom bent down and explained to Johnny why he shouldn't have done that. But she said, and she concludes here, what those teachers didn't understand is that my son is wired differently. That's it. She's got it. And if you don't remember anything else from this presentation today, please remember that. He's wired differently. How many children in your school are wired differently? Because when a baby, a child, is born into this world at 24 weeks, the brain is still white matter. It is not grey matter. The cortical folding has not begun, and the neuronal pathways which carry messages around the brain are not in place. Yes, of course, in the incubator, the brain continues to grow, but it is an external brain. We still, despite the technology advances, cannot replicate ex utero what can happen in utero. They are wired differently. And my challenge to you is, if they're wired differently, in what way do those children learn differently, and do you know? And when we know how they learn differently, in what ways are we teaching differently? Because I still believe that we are educating too many 21st century children with a raft of special educational needs with a 20th century toolkit. We do not have all of the pedagogy in our current 2010 toolkit that will meaningfully touch that child at their point of learning need. And that's one of the challenges of this project. It's not a criticism of our profession, it's a fact that children have changed under our feet with a rapidity that you would not believe. FASD. Some of you will have heard of, some will not. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Damage caused to an unborn child due to maternal consumption of alcohol. It's not just a little piffling thing, colleagues. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is the largest non-genetic cause of learning disability in the United Kingdom, because Britain has the highest female binge drinking rate in the world. 38% of women in the 16 to 25 age group binge 3 times a week. This group of children are presenting significant challenges, and the reason I've linked it with ADHD is that some of you are thinking, well, fetal alcohol, I don't have children like that in my school. Fetal alcohol is 1 in 100 children, so where are they? Well, a new study from the Irish psychiatrist Kieran O'Malley has actually firmly shown that many children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are clinical masqueraders, and their masquerade of choice is ADHD. If you scan the brain of an ADHD child, in 80% of cases, the frontal cerebellum, the vermis and the basal ganglia are all appreciably smaller. Why? My hypothesis, but now supported by the O'Malley study, would be maternal abuse of alcohol in utero. And those children are certainly wired differently, as this slide will show you. Look at the brain to your left, and then the brain to your right, which is the brain of a baby born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. You can see that the brain does not have the same level of cortical folding. The naked eye can see that some of the neuronal pathways are not there, are not in place. Wired differently? I finished in 2008 a study. I went back and did some postdoc work on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder at Oxford. And my challenge really was that we as a profession, because I'm still a teacher, we as a profession are pedagogically bereft. You press fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and search for information, you cannot find any teaching guidelines in the same way that you could for children with ASD, children with Down syndrome, children with cerebral palsy, cystic fibrosis, etc., etc. You can get that information. We had no guidelines in this country. When I finished that study, I went and pleaded with TDA. They gave some funding. 2 weeks ago, the report was put on the web with teaching guidelines for primary, for special, and for secondary, including academies. There are now teaching guidelines for how to teach children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We've just finished the study. Now, 5-10 years' time, somebody else can do that piece of work and it'll be much richer. But as a starting point, at least we have something. Because these children are really challenging. Part of the brain that is severely compromised with these children is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is what deals with numeracy and mathematical computation. In some of these children, if they're severely damaged, it can actually be absent. How do you teach maths to a child when the bit of the brain is actually missing? There are huge pedagogical challenges. This, I think, actually illuminates not just the learning of a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, but also of children with complex needs. Any child with a learning difficulty has an uneven profile. It's inherent in their learning difficulty. But with complex needs, what you have is a spiky profile. So here you can have an 18-year-old with actually quite advanced expressive language. But look, their emotional maturity down at 6-year-old level, money and time down at 8-year-old level, that's not uneven, colleagues, that's a spike. Recently, before I joined the Trust, I actually had a period of time, a very enjoyable period of time, working at the RSA Academy in Tipton. And it was absolutely fascinating there to see the Year 7 population coming in, and that some children would profile where they would have mathematical abilities at, say, P7, P8, but English literacy abilities up at L4, L5. Again, that's a spike. And this is one of the significant changes we've seen recently in our special needs child populations in schools. An autistic spectrum disorder. How many of you would tell me that you've far more children with autism in your schools this year than you had 10 years ago? Autism, by the latest study by Gillian Baird and colleagues in this country, autism in the UK now stands at 1 in 86 children. That's 1% of the child population. 1 in 86. The states have just finished their big study on prevalence in autism, and their figures come out at 1 in 90. So we're in the same ballpark. Go back to those earlier figures I gave you on preterm infants. We've been working as part of the SSAT's research project, we've been working with the University of Warwick, who are looking at the longitudinal study of premature infants in this country. And every few years they analyse this cohort that's moving through. And they've now discovered that 8% of children born prematurely go on to develop atypical autism. So when you have factors like that contributing, is it any wonder that ASD is becoming more and more prevalent in our schools? And then there's the whole thing about chromosomal disorders. I've put there Fragile X syndrome. Again, some of you will think, what's that? Never heard of it. Fragile X is the largest genetic cause of learning disability in the UK. It's 1 in 500 children. And they have very unusual pedagogical pathways for learning. You could not give direct instruction from the child with Fragile X from in front. You have to give instruction from behind. What are the dynamics in an inclusive classroom of managing that sort of situation? In our national cohort of children, when I've got an absolutely superb core research team that I'm working with, and when they did the analysis, we discovered we had 19 different types of rare syndrome. I thought, 19 different types of rare syndrome. I've been 30 years in this game. I don't know 19 types of rare syndrome. And I went back to my 1980s textbooks, and I would read, a child with this syndrome is expected to live till 18 months. A child with that syndrome is expected to live till 4 or 5 years of age. But the same medical interventions that are keeping those premature babies alive are keeping alive children with rare syndromes. They're coming into our schools. And we, colleagues, have no pedagogical history of educating these children. That's where the challenge lies. I looked at a particular syndrome called Otahara syndrome. Those children fit for 3 days at a time. They have to sleep for prolonged periods. They're often nasogastric tube fed. Real challenges to learning in those children. The particular child I was thinking of, traditionally he would have died at 18 months, but he actually lived until he was 6.5, and his name was Ivan Cameron. I was so pleased that Tanya mentioned mental health this morning, and again Andy Burnham did. Lots of you nodded and clearly expressed that this is a major issue. At the SSAT conference 2 years ago in a workshop, I reported that the national figure at that point in time for mental health in typically developing children was 1 in 10 children. 1 in 10. And I said that I felt the onset of the recession and some of the new social toxins, because much as Tanya was right to articulate the wonderful learning opportunities technology brings, it also brings, particularly through cyberbullying, some downsides. There are new social toxins that are eating at the mental health and emotional well-being of our children. And I said then that I felt that we were heading for 2 in 10 children. And again, that was reported in the Times Ed, and I had a bit of a rough ride for daring to say such a thing. Well, I did not, with any glee, receive these figures, but the BMA have just finished their study, which reports that 2 in 10 children in the UK now have a mental health problem. One of the things we've been doing in the Complex Needs Project is actually working on a series of booklets to support you in schools. And one of those booklets is on mental health, the other's on families that I referred to earlier. Those booklets are here. They're for sale at this conference, and there's information if you want to get that from the SSAT Help Desk. But those are there for you. They've been developed in collaboration with schools, through think pieces online, through lots of debate. The Complex Needs Project is currently being trialled by 50 schools, 50 special schools in England, and 15 international schools. Australia, New Zealand, the United States, because we need to learn from each other. We need to borrow each other's research. And in January, we're going into mainstream schools, into primary, into secondary, and into early year settings, in line with the Trust's renewed commitment to 3 to 19 education. We feel it's really important to operate in all settings, including early years. And so by this time next year, we will have materials to support you and your schools in educating children with complex needs that will hopefully embrace the whole system. So we have new generation children. New generation children need new generation pedagogy. We're trying to, with our project at the moment, with schools, in classrooms, evolve pathways of pedagogy that, as I said, touch the child with complex learning difficulties and disabilities at their point of learning need. And so much of our work is about an emerging pedagogy. And from that, we're trying to take it to an articulated pedagogy. What does this actually look like? And from that, because we don't want it to be something bolt-on, we're trying to make it a blended pedagogy. So which learners have complex learning difficulties and disabilities? And I always find this quote stunning because it talks about a wide group of learners who do not simply require a differentiated curriculum. Hang on. We have 4 legislated principles of the curriculum in this land: breadth, balance, relevance, and differentiation. And differentiation, for those of us working in the field of special educational needs, should be the hallmark of our practice. Differentiation is the process of adjusting teaching to meet individual needs. So what's more than differentiation? And this for me has been a real challenge in leading this project. And I think the point I've reached at the moment, but this is still a work in progress, is what I'm calling the meet and greet principle. When we differentiate, yes, we can come and meet the child at their point of learning need. But how do we greet the child? How do we envelop them as an active learner in the dynamics of your classroom? And I think that process is the process of personalization. That's actually how we envelop that child as an engaged, active learner that will enable them to make progress. Many of you are very familiar with the work of David Hargreaves, but I just love this particular quote because it talks about personalizing learning being to the profoundly personalized. That's it. That's absolutely it. For those of us working in SEN with children with complex needs, we need to have pedagogical pathways that are profoundly personalized. Because then we can go to new forms of enriched support. That might be the way you choose to allocate teaching assistants. It might be how you design your learning environments. And one of our colleagues in the team has just got her PhD in actually creating learning environments for children with autistic spectrum disorders. Absolutely fascinating piece of work. So again, there's new information all the time that can help and influence us. But let's not forget too the contribution of neuroscience. Professor Susan Greenfield would say that neuroscience is the personalization of the mind. And from this American text by David Souza, it tells us that research is revealing clues that help guide decisions and practices of educators working with students who have special needs. So MRI scans and fMRIs, the fact we can look inside the live brain can tell us so much about the learning pathways of those children. And we have to bear those things in mind and try and blend them now into what we're doing in schools. So the effective inclusive school in this 21st century, I think, has all of those features to it: creative pedagogy, evidence-based practice. But the key is engagement. And I was thrilled when Daniel Pink mentioned this morning engagement and linked it with motivation. You see, our work on engagement in schools so far has shown some dramatic differences for children. And I think engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation. Engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation. And the process we're in at the moment is personalizing engagement. Because you see, for too long, we've gone about this process of we're target-driven, aren't we? We have our learners in the middle, and we set our targets, and we plan how we're going to teach, how we're going to monitor, how we're going to evaluate the outcomes. What we forget to ask at the beginning is, and how will this child engage with this learning task? That's absolutely key. We've got to ask, how will this child engage? And our environments for engagement have to be enabling environments, creative pedagogy. And all of that links back to mental health. I couldn't believe the resonance with what Tanya and Daniel were saying this morning, and indeed to some degree what Andy Burnham's just said. But one of our teachers made this link for us, that increasing engagement in learning, getting those children as active participants, not peripheral participants, standing on the sidelines watching the learning of others, actually had a positive effect on students' emotional well-being and mental health state. So it's about an education, thankfully, of the whole child. But it has to be engagement with aspiration. HMI have been reviewing the work of the project, and we're trying to influence how Ofsted inspections, when they look at SEN, might actually look at engagement as an indicator of attainment in children. But it has to be, rightly so, engagement with aspiration. I mentioned that we're working internationally. We have to. We need evidence from New Zealand because they have the best studies on premature infants in the world. We need evidence from Australia because some of their work around fetal alcohol is fascinating. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they're the largest group of children going into fostering adoption in Australia and in the UK. Young people with fetal alcohol are the largest percentage group going into the criminal justice system. We need to learn from each other. And through INET, we've been able to network a whole raft of schools in other countries. Indeed, in our American schools, we're working through the University of South Florida. I thought this statement actually epitomized some of the things I'm trying to say to you, that we're dealing with children who are the next frontier of education. The INET Charter exhorts us to be navigators of learning. We are on a journey. As a profession, we need to stand up and say, we do not have all the answers. We're searching for those answers for and with this new generation that have dramatically changed in this first decade of the 21st century. And I invite you today to journey on with us, to become navigators of learning, to look at the materials this project is generating that will be available on the web when it's gone through the full research process from next March onwards. We're sharing information. This particular clip is actually of one of our New Zealand advisors who came to the UK and actually worked in classrooms. It's one world, one group of children. We can either try and solve this as an island nation, or we can collaborate. And there's so much to learn from each other. To end, I want to share these words. Because, as I've said, we've so much to learn from each other. We aspire to excellent pedagogy. We aspire to the best schools that we can offer to our children, to our vulnerable children. And our quest is to develop those personalized pathways, to have every child as an active learner. We need inquiry-based processes, and in schools, we need leadership that is inquiry-based leadership. This way, we'll go about that whole process of transformation that has been at the heart of this project, at the heart of SSAT, at the heart of INET. We have to do this for the sake of this new generation of children. You see, we need a whole community to develop a child. We are that community, and these are our children. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.